You don't realize how heavy silence is until a 12-foot apex predator walks into your docking bay and the entire station stops breathing. She smelled like wet copper and ozone, her massive, armored footfalls vibrating up through the soles of my boots. When the alien queen stopped dead in front of me, I didn't reach for a weapon. I just tightened my grip on a grease-stained wrench and waited. Instead of killing me, she leaned down, mandibles clicking, and whispered, "Human. My father often spoke of your kind. The environmental scrubbers in Bay 4 had been dying for a week. Every breath tasted like recycled sweat, stale coffee, and the sharp metallic tang of burnt coolant. I was flat on my back, jammed beneath the exposed underbelly of a freighter, trying to coax a blown plasma manifold back to life with a roll of conductive tape and sheer spite. My knuckles were bleeding again. The oil on my hands had mixed with the blood, turning into a thick, gritty paste. I was tired. Not the kind of tired a good night's sleep fixes, but the deep, marrow-level exhaustion that sets in when you've spent the last 10 years jumping from one decaying neutral station to another, trying to forget that your species is a dying breed. Then, the ambient temperature in the bay dropped. It wasn't a subtle shift. The back of my neck prickled. The low, comforting hum of the station's tertiary reactor seemed to choke, swallowed by a sudden, suffocating silence. I didn't move at first. You learn not to make sudden movements on the rim. I just stopped ratcheting the bolt and listened. There was a rhythmic clicking, heavy, deliberate, like steel ball bearings being dropped onto a ceramic floor. It was accompanied by a strange, rasping intake of air, wet and cavernous. Thrum, click, thrum. I slid out from under the freighter on my creeper, wiping my ruined hands on a rag that was already more grease than cloth. I sat up. There were usually 20 people in this bay, smugglers, mechanics, drifters. Now, they were all pressed against the bulkheads, perfectly still, eyes wide and fixed on the main airlock doors. She was already inside. The locals called them the Varak. We didn't call them anything, mostly because humanity hadn't had a seat at the galactic table in 2 decades. But I knew royalty when I saw it. She was towering, easily pushing 12 feet. Her posture stooped to avoid scraping the overhead conduit lines. Her body was a terrifying study in biological engineering, an obsidian carapace that absorbed the harsh, flickering sodium light of the hangar, segmented and layered like medieval plate armor. She didn't walk. She flowed. For something so massive, her movements were unnervingly silent, save for the clicking of the heavy, scythe-like appendages folded against her thorax. 4 royal guards flanked her. They were smaller, duller in color, twitching with nervous aggression. The air around them smelled sharp and acidic, like crushed ants and ozone. It made my eyes water. She was walking directly toward my freighter, toward me. My pulse was a dull, rhythmic ache behind my eyes. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel like a hero standing down a monster. I just felt a heavy, sinking resignation in my gut. I dropped the wrench. It hit the deck plating with a loud, ugly clank that echoed through the silent bay. The royal guards snapped their heads toward the sound, mandibles flaring, emitting a low, chittering hiss that rattled my teeth. The queen raised a single, 3-fingered hand. The guards froze. She stopped 3 feet from me. Up close, the sheer mass of her was suffocating. I could feel the heat radiating off her armored plates. I could hear the wet, heavy bellows of her lungs working in our oxygen-rich atmosphere. She looked down at me. Her eyes were compound, glittering like crushed glass in the dim light, offering absolutely nothing I could read. No empathy, no anger, just cold, calculating intellect. I didn't stand up. I stayed on the grease-stained floor, looking up at her, waiting for the end. I wasn't going to beg. I didn't have the energy for it. She leaned down. The movement was slow, fluid, her joints emitting a faint, hydraulic whine. Her face, a terrifying arrangement of armored plating and sharp mandibles, came within inches of mine. The smell of wet copper was overwhelming, turning my stomach. I held my breath. When she spoke, she didn't use a mechanical translator. She spoke English. The words were forced through a vocal tract that was never designed for them, resulting in a sound like grinding stones and tearing metal. It was a brutal, agonizing noise. "Human," she grated out, the syllables slow and heavily weighted. "My father often spoke of your kind." I stared at her. The silence in the hangar stretched, tight as a piano wire. I swallowed hard, tasting grit and old coffee. "Yeah," I rasped, my voice cracking from disuse. "And what did the old man say? Give you some good recipes?" It was a stupid thing to say, cynical, suicidal even. But I was tired, and the adrenaline was making me reckless. The guards hissed, taking a synchronized step forward, their talons gouging the steel deck. The Queen didn't move. She just stared at me, the compound eyes shifting microscopically. Then, the plates around her neck expanded, and she let out a short, violent burst of air. A laugh, or whatever passed for one in her species. "He said," the Queen rumbled, the heavy vibration of her voice rattling the tools on my cart, "that you were the only creatures in this cold universe who could look at a dying star and try to build a fire in its shadow." I shifted my weight on the hard deck, finally pulling myself up to a stand. My knees popped. I was 5'10". Standing in front of her, I felt like a child. I crossed my arms, tucking my filthy hands into my armpits to hide the slight tremor in my fingers. "Your father had a poetic streak," I said. "Most people just call us stubborn." "He was not a poet," she corrected, her heavy head tilting slightly to the right. The movement caught the light, revealing deep, jagged gouges across her left shoulder plate, scars from weapons fire, plasma burns. "He was a commander at Kepler's Ridge." The name hit me like a physical blow. The air suddenly felt too thin. Kepler's Ridge. The galaxy remembers it as a turning point. The history logs on the core worlds probably describe it as a brilliant strategic stalling maneuver. But I was there. I was a 19-year-old kid holding a kinetic rifle that jammed every third shot, shivering in a trench filled with freezing mud. The smell of burnt hair and vaporized blood permanently seared into my sinuses. "I know the ridge," I said. My voice sounded hollow, distant. "Your father was commanding the Varric forces?" "He led the vanguard," she said. "They expected your enclave to break in 3 cycles. You held for 60. He lost half his brood to starvation and cold, simply waiting for you to surrender. You never did." She was looking at me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve, like humanity was some grand mythical force of nature. It made me sick to my stomach. "We didn't hold because we were brave," I said, the words tasting like ash. We held because our transport ships were blown out of the sky on day 1. We had nowhere to go. We were cornered. Cornered beasts lash out, then die, the queen said, her mandibles clicking rhythmically. Your kind did not die. You adapted. You ate the dead flora. You drank the poisoned water. My father watched your lines from the ridgeline. He saw your soldiers freezing, amputating their own limbs to stop the rot, and then returning to the barricades. He said it was not defiance. It was a malfunction of your biology. You do not know how to end. I looked away from her, staring at the scarred bulkhead behind her guards. I saw Miller's face for a fraction of a second. Miller, who had lost his left eye to shrapnel on day 12 and spent the next 48 days making terrible jokes about depth perception until his heart simply gave out from the cold. We weren't heroes. We were terrified kids dying in the mud because the brass back on Earth miscalculated a jump route. The aliens saw unyielding resolve. I just remembered dysentery, crying in the dark, and eating synth paste mixed with grit until my gums bled. It's not a malfunction, I said quietly, looking back up into her alien eyes. It's just desperation. When you have nothing left to lose, you get real creative with how you stay alive. Desperation, she repeated, tasting the word. The guttural scrape of her voice softened slightly, though it still sounded like gravel in a blender. A fascinating catalyst. My species does not experience it. We calculate. We project. If a battle has a 0% probability of success, we withdraw. If a world is dying, we abandon it. It is logical. Logic is a luxury for people with a safety net, I muttered, wiping my nose with the back of my wrist, leaving a smear of grease on my face. Humans haven't had a safety net in a long time. Indeed, she said. She shifted her massive weight, the hydraulic hiss of her joints echoing in the quiet hangar. The onlookers were still frozen, terrified to even whisper. That is why I have traveled across 3 sectors to find this station. To find you, I frowned. The lingering fear in my chest was slowly being replaced by a cynical exhaustion. I knew this script. I'd seen it play out on a micro scale a dozen times in the dive bars of the Rim. Someone needs a dirty job done. Someone needs a body to throw into the meat grinder. They always look for the humans. Let me guess, I said, leaning against the cold metal of my freighter's hull. You've got a problem that logic can't solve. Some unwinnable scenario. A suicide mission. And you figured you'd track down one of the galaxy's resident cockroaches to see if we'll walk into the fire for you. The royal guards hissed loudly, one of them drawing a heavy, glowing energy pike from its side. The weapon hummed with lethal intent. The queen didn't even look at her guard. She just lowered her head, bringing her face uncomfortably close to mine again. The ambient heat coming off her was intense, smelling of ozone and old blood. You are crude, she said softly, the grinding of her voice dropping to a low, rumbling purr that rattled my ribs. But you are not incorrect. I let out a long, slow breath. Of course. It was always a suicide mission. Look, Your Majesty, I said, rubbing the back of my neck. My muscles were screaming in protest from lying on the cold deck for 6 hours. I don't know who gave you my coordinates, but they sold you a bad bill of goods. I'm a mechanic. I patch up junker ships so smugglers can run black market grain past the core blockades. I don't do wars anymore. I don't do unwinnable scenarios. I just want to fix this manifold, drink a lukewarm beer, and sleep for 12 hours. Your name is Dean Carter, she said. Her refusal to acknowledge my denial was maddening. You served in the 104th Orbital Drop Division. You survived Kepler's Ridge. You survived the fall of Ethelgard. You survived the quarantine ships at Charybdis. I flinched. The names were like rusty nails being driven into the floorboards of my mind. Ethelgard, Charybdis. Places where the sky burned and the air tasted like ash. Places where I had left pieces of my humanity behind, trading them for another sunrise. Yeah, I survived, I snapped, the anger finally flaring up, hot and bitter in my chest. I stepped away from the freighter, closing the distance between us. I had to crane my neck to look at her, but I didn't care. That doesn't make me a soldier anymore. It just makes me lucky, or cursed, depending on the day. I do not require a soldier, Dean Carter, the Queen said, unbothered by my anger. I have millions of soldiers, bred for war, armed with weaponry that can glass a continent. They are flawless, they are logical, and they are currently being slaughtered. That stopped me. The Varric Empire was the undisputed superpower of the Orion Spur. They didn't lose wars. They certainly didn't get slaughtered. Slaughtered by who? I asked, the skepticism heavy in my voice. A biological anomaly, she said, her mandibles clicking in a rapid, agitated rhythm. An aggressive fungal network that consumes and repurposes necrotic tissue. It was discovered on a fringe mining colony. It does not think. It does not feel fear. It simply expands. When my fleets engage it, they run their tactical simulations. The simulations tell them the battle is lost, and so they withdraw to minimize casualties. They cede the territory. The network grows. So change the parameters, I said. Tell them not to withdraw. You do not understand my kind, she replied, her compound eyes dimming slightly. We are bound by the calculations of our hive mind. To fight a battle that the mind deems unwinnable is a physical impossibility for my soldiers. It induces cognitive paralysis. They literally cannot pull the trigger if the probability of success reaches 0. I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around it. You're telling me your troops are too smart to fight a losing battle, so they're just letting themselves get backed into a corner? Yes. She paused, and for a moment, the terrifying 12-foot apex predator looked profoundly tired. It was a subtle drop in her posture, a slight dimming of her bioluminescence, but I recognized it. It was the same exhaustion I saw in the mirror every morning. The network has consumed 4 of our core breeding worlds. The hive mind calculates a complete systemic collapse within 6 standard months. I shook my head, the absurdity of it all washing over me. And you want me to do what? Go shoot the fungus? I'm one guy with a wrench. I want you, the Queen said, her voice dropping to a harsh, metallic whisper, to lead my vanguard. I laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound that echoed in the silent hangar. You've got to be kidding me. Your troops won't listen to me. I'm an ape to them. They will listen to you, because I will sever their connection to the hive mind, she stated. The words were delivered with a cold precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. The hangar was dead quiet. I knew enough about Varric biology to know what she was suggesting. Severing a Varric from the hive mind was considered worse than death. It was complete sensory isolation. It drove them mad. You'd blind them, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I will deafen them to the logic of defeat, she corrected, her massive head lowering until we were eye to eye. They will experience true terror for the first time in their lives. They will be deaf, blind, and cornered. They will not know how to fight without the hive to guide them. She raised one of her massive scythe-like arms and pointed a sharp, chitinous digit at my chest. But you do. You know how to operate in the dark. You know how to fight when there is no hope, when the cold sets in, and when the probability of success is absolute zero. I do not want you to give them orders, Dean Carter. I want you to teach them the malfunction of your biology. She stepped closer, the smell of copper and ozone drowning out the stale air of the bay. I want you to teach my perfect soldiers how to die like humans. I stared at the Queen for a long, agonizing minute. The hydraulic whine in her joints was the only sound in the docking bay. The silence felt heavy enough to snap my spine. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, the grease in my fingerprints stark black against my pale, bruised skin. I thought about the plasma manifold waiting for me under the freighter. I thought about the 4 credits in my pocket, the lukewarm synthetic beer waiting in my bunk, and the slow, suffocating trajectory of the rest of my life. I was 32 years old, and I was already a ghost. Humanity was a ghost, haunting the fringes of a galaxy that had moved on without us. If I say no, I asked, my voice dry as chalk dust. I will leave, the Queen stated. There was no malice in her terrifying, grinding voice. I will return to my fleet. We will continue our logical, calculated retreat until there is no territory left to cede. My species will go extinct in silence, and the anomaly will eventually reach this station. She didn't threaten to kill me. She didn't have to. The math was already done. I let out a harsh breath through my nose, wiping my dirty hands on my coveralls one last time. Fine, I muttered, the word tasting like a mouthful of copper. But I need my own gear. I'm not wearing your bug armor. 2 hours later, I was standing in the belly of a Varric dreadnought. The transition from the grime and oil of the neutral station to the alien warship was violently jarring. There were no right angles here. The corridors were vast, sweeping tunnels of smooth, bone-white resin that pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent violet light. The air was frigid and smelled sharply of ammonia and crushed chalk. It stung my nostrils and made the back of my throat itch. I felt entirely, horrifyingly out of place in my patched kinetic armor and scuffed combat boots, clutching a surplus heavy-cycle rifle that was held together mostly by hope and welding slag. The Queen led me to a staging cavern. That was the only word for it. It was a massive, domed chamber that could have comfortably housed a heavy cruiser. Lined up in perfect, terrifying symmetry were the vanguard. There were 500 of them. They were larger than the Royal Guards, their carapaces a matte, light-absorbing black. They stood in perfectly spaced rows, absolutely motionless. Not a single twitch of a mandible. Not a single shift of weight. 500 massive, heavily armed apex predators breathing in exact, synchronized unison. The wet thrum hiss of their collective respiration echoed off the vaulted ceiling. It was beautiful in a sterile, terrifying way. And it was completely wrong. Nothing alive is that still. They are currently networked, the Queen murmured, standing beside me. Her voice vibrated in my chest cavity. They see through 500 pairs of eyes. They calculate threat vectors using a shared cortex. They are a single, flawless organism. And they're losing, I said, gripping my rifle tighter, just to feel the cold, reassuring steel of the barrel. They are losing, she agreed. She stepped out into the center of the chamber. She didn't give a speech. She didn't offer a rallying cry. She simply closed her compound eyes, extended her primary arms, and let out a sound I will never, ever forget. It wasn't a roar. It was a low, oscillating frequency, pitched somewhere in the register of a shifting tectonic plate. It bypassed my ears entirely and vibrated directly in the fluid of my brain. My vision blurred. I dropped to one knee, clutching my head as a sharp, agonizing pressure spiked behind my eyes. I tasted blood in the back of my mouth. Then came the physical reaction from the vanguard. It wasn't a synchronized movement. It was absolute catastrophic chaos. The perfect formation shattered in a fraction of a second. The severing wasn't just a mental disconnect. It was a physical trauma. The soldiers began to thrash. Heavy, scythe-like limbs struck the resin deck, gouging deep trenches in the floor. Some collapsed, curling into tight, trembling balls, emitting high-pitched, screeching wails that sounded like tearing metal. Others lashed out blindly, colliding with their neighbors. A thick, clear fluid began to leak from the spiracles along their thoraxes, the Varak equivalent of tears, or maybe blood. The smell in the room changed instantly. The sharp ammonia was flooded with a potent, acrid stench. Pheromones. Pure, unadulterated terror. I forced myself up, my head pounding, my stomach threatening to heave. I watched 500 perfect logical killing machines regress into frightened blind animals in the span of 10 seconds. They were bumping into each other, shrieking, their heavy plasma cannons firing wild, blinding bursts of blue energy into the ceiling, melting the resin and raining molten slag down upon themselves. "Stop them!" I yelled over the deafening cacophony, shielding my face from the sparks. "They're going to kill each other." "I cannot," the Queen's voice rasped, devoid of its usual authority. She looked physically diminished, her posture sagging. "They cannot hear me. They cannot hear the collective. They are alone in their minds, for the first time." She turned her massive, terrifying face toward me. "Take command, human, or let them die here." I stood frozen for 3 heartbeats, the sheer absurdity of the situation pinning my boots to the deck. I was a mechanic. I hadn't led a squad since Kepler's Ridge, and even then, I had led them mostly into early graves. Now I was supposed to wrangle 500 10-foot-tall insects having a collective psychic breakdown. A stray plasma bolt scorched the deck 2 feet from my left boot, the radiant heat singeing the hair on my leg through my armor. That did it. The paralysis broke, replaced by the hot, familiar spike of adrenaline and sheer, cynical annoyance. I didn't try to shout over them. You can't out-yell a panic attack. I slung my rifle over my back, reached down to my thigh rig, and pulled out a heavy industrial shock grenade, a tool we used for deep core mining, designed to shatter dense rock formations with concussive force and blinding light. I primed the cylinder, waited 2 agonizing seconds, and hurled it directly into the center of the thrashing mass of armored bodies. "Brace!" I screamed, dropping to my chest and covering the back of my neck. The detonation didn't boom. It cracked like the sky splitting open. The concussive wave hit me like a solid wall of water, driving the breath from my lungs and rattling the fillings in my teeth. A blinding flash of white light bleached the cavern, overloading my retinas for a solid 5 seconds. When the spots in my eyes finally began to clear, the cavern was silent. The high-pitched wails had stopped. The vanguard soldiers were on the floor, their carapaces coated in the clear, viscous fluid leaking from their spiracles. The concussive blast had disrupted their inner ear analogs, temporarily stunning them. They were twitching, disoriented, their compound eyes blinking rapidly in the harsh, smoking aftermath of the grenade. I stood up. Every joint in my body ached. I unslung my rifle, racked the charging handle with a loud, distinct clack, and walked directly into the center of the carnage. I stopped in front of the largest soldier. It was slowly pushing itself up on trembling, heavily armored forelegs. Its mandibles were clicking erratically, a physical manifestation of panic. It looked at me, not past me, not through me to a collective intelligence. It looked at me, and in its massive shattered glass eyes, I saw something I recognized intimately. Isolation. Cold, suffocating isolation. "Stand up," I said. My voice wasn't a roar. It was low, hard, and entirely devoid of pity. The creature just chittered weakly, its head swiveling, looking for a connection that wasn't there. I stepped closer, ignoring the smell of its terror, and slammed the butt of my rifle hard against its chest plate. The impact rang out like a hammer on an anvil. The alien flinched violently, rearing back. "I said stand up," I snarled, stepping into its space again. "The hive is gone. The math is gone. Nobody is coming to do the thinking for you. It's just you, in your own head. It's quiet, isn't it? It's terrifying." The soldier stared down at me. I was a fragile, fleshy thing. It could have severed my torso with a casual flick of its arm. But it didn't. It just stayed frozen, captivated by the only creature in the room that wasn't falling apart. "That silence in your head," I continued, projecting my voice so the ones closest could hear the sharp, jagged edges of human English. "That's not death. That's you. That's your pulse. Now pick up your weapon." I kicked the heavy dropped plasma rifle lying on the deck. It slid against the alien's massive claws. The soldier hesitated. It reached down, its movements jerky, uncoordinated, like a puppet with tangled strings. It grasped the weapon. "Good," I muttered, wiping a smear of blood from my nose where the grenade blast had burst a capillary. I turned to look at the rest of them. They were slowly picking themselves up, watching me. Hundreds of towering, lethal predators waiting for a hairless ape to tell them how to exist. "Listen to me," I barked, pacing the line. "Your queen says you run when the odds drop to 0. You run because the math tells you you're already dead. Well, guess what? You are already dead." I pointed a finger at the cavern walls. "The hive cut you off. To the rest of your empire, you don't exist anymore. You're ghosts, just like me." I stopped pacing, letting the silence hang. And ghosts don't have to worry about statistics. Ghosts don't have to worry about surviving. You just have to worry about making the bastards on the other side bleed before you go down. I didn't know if the translator implants were conveying the nuance of what I was saying, or if my tone was just angry enough to cut through their panic. But they were still. They were listening. "We drop in 20 minutes, I said, turning my back on them and walking toward the loading bays. "Check your gear. If you puke, do it in your helmets. Let's go." The drop was a nightmare. Varric drop pods weren't designed for human physiology. They were built for creatures with exoskeletons that could withstand immense atmospheric pressure. I was strapped into a makeshift harness, my organs sloshing uncomfortably as the dreadnought ejected us into the void. The descent was brutal. The metal walls of the pod shrieked as we hit the atmosphere of the infected colony. The heat inside spiked instantly, the air turning thick and stifling. Beside me, 3 Vanguard soldiers were locked into their shock frames. They didn't speak. They were trembling. Without the hive mind to distribute the psychological load of the drop, they were experiencing the claustrophobia and the violent G-forces in raw, unfiltered agony. My vision narrowed to a pinprick, graying out at the edges. I gritted my teeth, tasting bile in the back of my throat. I hated dropping. I hated the feeling of being entirely out of control, just a piece of meat inside a bullet, hurtling toward the ground. "Almost there," I choked out, forcing the words through lungs that felt like they were collapsing. "Brace for impact." The Varric didn't respond. They just clamped their compound eyes shut, their mandibles locked tight. The pod slammed into the earth with the force of a train wreck. My harness dug brutally into my collarbones, snapping my head forward. My teeth clicked together, violently enough to chip a molar. For a moment there was nothing but ringing in my ears and the smell of my own sweat. Then, the explosive bolts on the pod door fired. The heavy resin door blew outward, hitting the ground with a dull, wet thud. The air that rushed into the pod didn't smell like a battlefield. Battlefields smell like ozone, burnt propellant, and vaporized metal. This smelled like a slaughterhouse that had been left in the sun for a month. It was a thick, sickly sweet stench of rotting meat, overlaid with a heavy sulfuric odor that immediately made my eyes water. I unclipped my harness, my fingers numb and clumsy. I grabbed my rifle, slapped a fresh battery pack into the receiver, and stumbled out of the pod. The landscape was wrong. It used to be a strip mining colony. I could see the jagged outlines of terraforming spires in the distance, but they were choking beneath a thick, pulsating web of pale, fleshy vines. The ground beneath my boots wasn't dirt or metal. It was a spongy, porous biomass that gave way slightly with every step. It oozed a milky, yellow fluid where my treads broke the surface. The sky above was entirely blocked out by a thick, swirling canopy of pale gray spores. It looked like dirty snow falling in reverse, drifting lazily through a sickly, bruised purple atmosphere. My Vanguard squad clattered out behind me. They stepped onto the biomass and immediately recoiled, their heavy claws sinking into the fleshy ground. They looked around, their weapons trembling in their grips. Without the hive mind to process the sensory data, the sheer, overwhelming horror of the landscape was hitting them all at once. "Keep moving," I ordered, my voice muffled by the thick, sound-dampening air. "Do not let the spores settle on your joints." We advanced through the ruins of a processing facility. The metal bulkheads had been torn apart, warped outward as if something massive had expanded inside them. Swaths of gray-green fungal blooms covered the walls, slowly digesting the steel. It was utterly silent. "Contact!" a jagged mechanical voice rasped in my earpiece. It was the squad leader, a massive Varric whose armor was scarred with deep plasma burns. I raised my rifle, peering through the gloom. Through the shifting curtain of spores, shapes began to emerge. They weren't animals. They weren't soldiers. They were a grotesque mockery of both. They used to be the colony's mining drones, heavy quadrupedal machines built of iron and hydraulics. But the fungus had taken them. Pale, muscular vines had woven themselves through the machinery, acting as synthetic ligaments. Fleshy, pulsing sacs of biological matter bulged from the exhaust ports. They moved with a horrific, jerky gait, a terrifying fusion of dead metal and reanimated meat. There were dozens of them, then hundreds. Shambling out of the fog, their visual sensors glowing a sickly, pale yellow beneath layers of translucent fungal film. I glanced at the Varrock. They were frozen. I could see the hesitation in their posture, their internal logic, the ingrained instinct of a species built on cold calculation was screaming at them. The numbers were too high. The terrain was disadvantageous. The probability of success was 0. The phantom limb of their hive mind was begging them to retreat. The squad leader took a slow, agonizing step backward, its heavy plasma cannon dipping toward the ground. No, I thought, my grip tightening on my rifle. Not today. We don't retreat today. Hey! I screamed, my voice tearing raw through my throat. The squad leader twitched, looking down at me. Watch me, I roared. I didn't take cover. I didn't calculate angles or check my telemetry. I just stepped out from behind a rusted steel beam, planted my boots directly into the squelching biomass, and brought the heavy cycle rifle to my shoulder. I targeted the largest mechanical abomination in the front line. I didn't aim for the metal. I aimed for the pulsing fleshy sac where the drone's power core used to be. I pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked like a mule, slamming into my shoulder with enough force to bruise the bone. The heavy kinetic slug tore through the thick air, a streak of white-hot friction, and impacted the fungal mass dead center. The sac detonated. It didn't explode like a bomb. It burst like a rotten fruit, spraying acidic, yellow fluid across the ruined street. The drone let out a distorted mechanical shriek and collapsed in a tangle of twitching vines and sparking wires. I racked the bolt, the spent casing clinking against the fleshy ground, and immediately fired again. I hit the next one in the joint. It stumbled, dragging its front leg. I fired a third time, the recoil making my shoulder ache with a dull, throbbing heat. Fire! I screamed at the Varrock, my voice cracking, saliva flying from my lips. Fire your goddamn weapons! Make them bleed! I was a tiny, fragile speck of flesh, standing in the open, completely exposed, doing something utterly devoid of logic. I was throwing pebbles at a landslide. It was the most irrational, desperate, uniquely human thing they had ever witnessed. The squad leader stared at me. Then it looked at the advancing horde of fungal drones. It looked back at me, watching the rhythmic, stubborn recoil of my rifle as I fired into the mass. Something clicked. It wasn't a tactical calculation. It was the sudden, raw understanding of spite. The squad leader let out a terrifying, jagged hiss, a sound that originated entirely from its own throat, not borrowed from a collective. It stepped forward, planting its massive legs, and raised its heavy plasma cannon. The blue light charged with a high-pitched whine that cut through the silence of the dead world. When the Varrock fired, it wasn't a single shot. It was a continuous blinding beam of superheated plasma that tore through the spore-choked air and slammed into the front ranks of the infected drones. The heat was instantaneous and staggering. Fleshy vines instantly vaporized into steam. Metal chassis glowed white-hot and melted. The smell of cooked meat and burning ozone washed over me, thick and suffocating. The other 499 Vanguard soldiers didn't wait for an order. They didn't need the math anymore. The logic of retreat was shattered, replaced by the sheer, chaotic violence of survival. The sky lit up. 500 heavy plasma cannons opened fire simultaneously. The noise was apocalyptic. It wasn't the precise, coordinated volley of a flawless army. It was messy. It was desperate. Beams crisscrossed wildly, sweeping through the ruins, tearing the fungal abominations to pieces. I dropped to one knee, covering my ears, the heat washing over my armor like a physical wave. I kept firing my rifle, picking off the stragglers that managed to crawl through the inferno, my shoulder numb, my breath coming in ragged, harsh gasps. We weren't a perfect calculating machine anymore. We were cornered beasts. We were loud. We were blind. And we were terrified. And for the first time in their history, the Varric Vanguard were fighting like humans. The echo of the last plasma discharge faded, swallowed almost instantly by the thick, spongy walls of the infected colony. I stayed on one knee for a long time. My heavy cycle rifle was venting white smoke from the barrel, the metal ticking as it cooled. The air was a stagnant soup of vaporized biomass, ozone, and the distinct, nauseating smell of cooked meat. I tasted copper. I spat a wad of dark saliva onto the squelching ground and finally looked around. The Vanguard were still. They weren't standing in perfect formation. They were scattered across the ruined street, hunched over their weapons, their massive chests heaving. The clear, viscous fluid was still leaking from their spiracles, but the panicked chittering had stopped. They were looking at the carnage they had just unleashed. Hundreds of fungal drones lay in burning heaps, their fleshy vines curling and blackening in the heat. I pushed myself up. My knees popped loudly. Every muscle in my back felt like it had been stretched over an anvil and beaten with a hammer. "Reload," I croaked. My throat was raw. I coughed, clearing the spore-laden dust from my lungs, and racked my bolt. I said reload. They heard that. More are coming. The squad leader, the one with the scarred armor, jerked its head toward me. Its heavy hands fumbled with the locking mechanism of its plasma cannon, eventually ejecting the spent thermal core. The glowing cylinder hit the ground with a hiss, melting a small hole into the biomass. I walked over to him. He was a head taller than the rest, his carapace a shade darker, pitted with micrometeorite strikes and old kinetic scoring. "What's your designation?" I asked, looking up into his compound eyes. He stared at me. The translator in my ear clicked, trying to parse the frantic clicking of his mandibles. "Unit, Vanguard 7 Delta. Network, severed. I am disconnected." The mechanical voice was flat, but the physical reality of the creature was trembling. He was experiencing the sheer, unadulterated terror of individuality. "Forget the network," I said, my voice low. "Your name is Nash now. It's shorter, saves breath." Nash tilted his head. "Nash, a meaningless phonetic designation. It means you're breathing, and it means you're in charge of this flank," I snapped, pointing down the ruined street toward the looming, spore-choked silhouette of the terraforming spire. "We push to the spire. We plant the charges on the central atmospheric processors. We burn this fungus out from the roots." Before Nash could process the command, a shrill, tearing screech echoed from our left. I spun around, bringing my rifle up. It wasn't an enemy. It was one of ours. A vanguard soldier was thrashing on the ground. During the chaotic crossfire, a massive piece of heavy mining equipment, dislodged by an errant plasma bolt, had collapsed, pinning the alien's lower right leg. The limb was crushed flat against the resin deck, a thick, dark green ichor pooling around the impact site. The rest of the vanguard just watched him. They didn't move. They didn't render aid. To their ingrained genetic logic, a mobility-compromised unit in a hostile environment with zero chance of extraction was already a casualty. The hive mind would have instantly reallocated resources, shutting down the pain receptors in the dying soldier and abandoning it. But there was no hive mind to shut down the pain. The soldier was shrieking in raw, unfiltered agony, its claws tearing uselessly at the steel girder. I sprinted over, the spongy ground sucking at my boots. "Nash!" I yelled. "Get over here! Bring 3 others!" Nash hesitated. "The unit is compromised. Mathematical survival probability is—" "If you say the word probability to me, I will shoot you in the eye myself," I roared, grabbing the heavy steel girder with both hands. I pulled. I might as well have been trying to lift a mountain. "Get over here and lift this damn thing." Nash stepped forward, the physical intimidation of my anger overriding his paralyzing logic. He motioned to 3 others. They lumbered over, their movements hesitant, confused. They wedged their massive scythe-like forearms under the girder. "On 3, I grunted, my boots sliding in the alien blood and fungal slime. 1, 2, 3, lift. The Varak strained. Their hydraulic joints whined, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that set my teeth on edge. The girder shifted, groaned, and rose 6 inches. I reached down, grabbed the wounded soldier by the edge of its breastplate, and hauled backward with everything I had. The alien slid free, leaving a mangled, flattened ruin of a leg behind. The girder crashed back down. The wounded Varak was hyperventilating, its mandibles clicking in a chaotic, broken rhythm. It was trying to stand, its brain unable to process that the limb was no longer functional. It crashed back to the deck, shrieking again. I dropped to my knees beside it. I pulled a heavy canvas tourniquet from my thigh rig, sized for a human torso, but just wide enough for a Varak appendage. "Hold him down!" I barked at Nash. Nash pinned the thrashing soldier's shoulders. I looped the canvas strap above the crushed joint, fed the buckle, and cranked the windlass rod as hard as I could. The heavy canvas bit deep into the chitin. The flow of green ichor slowed to a sluggish ooze. I slapped the locking ring into place, my hands slick with alien blood. I stood up, breathing hard. The entire squad of 500 was staring at me. The silence was absolute, save for the ragged breathing of the wounded soldier. "Listen to me," I said, projecting my voice. I didn't yell this time. I spoke with the dead, flat certainty of a man who had dug too many graves in freezing mud. "I know how your empire works. You do the math. You drop the dead weight. You move on." I walked slowly down the line, meeting their fractured, terrifying gazes. "That stops today. We don't have a hive. We only have each other. You are not units anymore. You are a squad." I held up a finger, dripping with green blood. "There are 3 rules for the Vanguard now. Rule 1. We shoot until the guns melt. Rule 2. We do not calculate the odds because the odds are always 0. Rule 3. Nobody gets left behind. If they can't walk, you carry them. If they can't shoot, you give them a grenade. You do not let them die alone. I stopped in front of Nash. Pick him up. Nash looked down at the wounded soldier. For a creature bred to be a flawless gear in a vast machine, the concept of carrying a broken part was anathema. It was inefficient. It was dangerous. But Nash looked at the blood on my hands. He looked at the tourniquet. And then he reached down, grabbed his wounded brother by the harness, and hoisted the massive weight over his shoulder. The wounded Varak let out a low, trembling hiss, but locked its remaining arms around Nash's neck. Good, I muttered, wiping my hands on my thighs. Now let's go break some machinery. The closer we got to the terraforming spire, the worse the atmosphere became. The air was a thick, physical weight in my lungs. My helmet's basic filtration system was struggling, whining as it tried to scrub the heavy sulfuric spores from my oxygen supply. I was sweating profusely, the salt stinging my eyes. Every step was a battle against the terrain. The fungal biomass had grown over a meter thick, concealing jagged edges of ruined metal and deep, acidic pools of dissolved rock. The spire itself was a monolithic structure of blackened steel, originally designed to pull toxic gases from the atmosphere and vent breathable air. Now, it was doing the exact opposite. It was wrapped in a suffocating embrace of thick, pulsating vines. The metal groaned under the immense pressure. At the base, a pair of massive vaulted blast doors hung off their hinges, warped inward by sheer force. We stacked up on the perimeter. Out of the original 500, we were down to 480. 20 had been lost to ambush predators, stealthy, spider-like amalgamations of mining drills and fungal muscle that dropped from the decaying overpasses. The Varak were changing. I could see it in their posture. They weren't standing rigidly. They were crouching, scanning the shadows, their weapons held tight to their chests. They flinched at loud noises. They checked their flanks. They were experiencing paranoia, stress, and the heavy grinding fatigue of constant vigilance. They were learning the ugly, necessary habits of infantrymen. The atmospheric processors are in the central core. 3 levels down, I whispered over the local comms, leaning against a rusted transport rover. We have to breach the main floor, hold the perimeter, and get a demolition team to the basement. Nash knelt beside me. He was still carrying the wounded soldier on his back. The physical toll on him was immense. His breath was a harsh, wet rasp. The concentration of hostiles inside the structure is dense, Nash translated, his mandibles twitching. I can hear them, the vibrations in the deck plating. I pressed my hand against the ground. He was right. The spongy biomass was vibrating with a steady, rhythmic thrumming. Thousands of heavy footsteps. We don't have the luxury of a siege, I said, unhooking 2 heavy mining charges from my belt. We go in fast, we go in loud, and we don't stop moving until we hit the stairwell. I tossed one of the charges to Nash. He caught it with a clumsy, massive hand. Set the timer for 10 seconds. Throw it as deep into the lobby as you can. Then we sweep. I didn't wait for confirmation. I primed my charge, the digital readout glowing a harsh red in the gloom. I stepped out from behind the rover, wound my arm back, and hurled the explosive through the ruined blast doors. Nash threw his a second later. "Cover!" I yelled, diving face first into the muck. The twin detonations were deafening in the enclosed space of the plaza. A massive plume of yellow fire and vaporized meat blew outward through the doors, followed by a shock wave that rattled my teeth. "Move! Move! Move!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet and charging into the smoke. The interior of the spire was a slaughterhouse. The lobby was a cavernous space, entirely overtaken by the rot. The ceiling dripped with a highly corrosive acid that hissed as it hit the floor. The mining charges had cleared a 30-foot crater in the center of the room, leaving behind a smoking perimeter of pulverized fungal drones. But they were already swarming back. They poured from the ventilation shafts, from the elevator banks, from breaches in the walls. They were larger here, hulks, amalgamations of heavy cargo loaders and dense, armored biomatter. They didn't shoot. They just charged, swinging massive hydraulic claws dripping with acid. "Form a perimeter!" I bellowed, firing my rifle from the hip. The kinetic slug tore the leg off a charging drone, but it kept coming, dragging itself forward on its remaining limbs. The vanguard deployed. They didn't form a perfect calculated firing line. They formed a ragged, desperate circle around the crater, plasma cannons whining as they unleashed a torrent of blue fire into the gloom. It wasn't a battle, it was a brawl. The distance closed too fast. The plasma weapons overheated, their warning chimes drowned out by the shrieks of the infected machines. I saw a Hulk crash into the vanguard line. It swung a rusted I-beam, catching a Varak soldier in the chest plate. The chitin cracked with a sickening snap, throwing the massive alien backward. Before the Hulk could finish the kill, Nash dropped his wounded comrade, roared a jagged, terrifying hiss, and tackled the fungal monstrosity. It was horrifying to watch. Without their ranged weapons, the Varak resorted to their biology. Nash wrapped his upper arms around the Hulk's torso, his mandibles tearing brutally into the fleshy sacs pulsing on its back. Acid sprayed everywhere, burning deep, smoking pits into Nash's armor, but he didn't let go. He drove his scythe-like lower limbs into the drone's joints, ripping machinery and meat apart with sheer, savage force. I was backed against a support pillar, my rifle clicking dry. I dropped the magazine, my fingers slick with sweat, and slammed a fresh one home. A shadow fell over me. I looked up. A spider drone had crawled down the pillar. Its visual sensor glowed a sickly yellow inches from my face. It lunged, a serrated mining drill spinning up with a high-pitched whine. I threw myself sideways, but I wasn't fast enough. The drill grazed my left shoulder. The kinetic armor absorbed the brunt of it, but the sheer force shattered my collarbone. White-hot pain lanced down my spine. My vision whited out, my breath leaving my lungs in a ragged scream. I hit the floor hard, my rifle skittering away into the darkness. The drone reared up to finish me. Suddenly, a massive black armored foot slammed down onto the drone's chassis, pinning it to the floor. A heavy plasma cannon pressed directly against the creature's central mass and fired. The drone vaporized into a cloud of ash and steam. I blinked through the pain, clutching my ruined shoulder. It was the wounded soldier, the one with the crushed leg. He was propped up on one knee, using his plasma rifle as a crutch, his chest heaving. He looked down at me, his compound eyes glittering in the dim light. He didn't speak. He just reached down with his free hand, grabbed the collar of my harness, and hauled me roughly to my feet. He pressed my rifle back into my good hand. Rule 3, I thought, a bitter, breathless laugh escaping my lips. Nobody gets left behind. Basement! I screamed over the chaos, ignoring the agonizing fire in my shoulder. I pointed toward the heavy reinforced doors at the back of the lobby. Breach the stairwell! Nash, get the demolition charges! We're running out of time! The core was a nightmare of heat and noise. The central atmospheric processor was a massive, cylindrical reactor buried 3 levels beneath the surface. The fungus had rooted itself deeply here, tapping into the reactor's geothermal energy to fuel its rapid expansion. The vines here were thick as tree trunks, pulsing with an angry, bioluminescent purple light. It took us 20 minutes of brutal, close-quarter slaughter to secure the room. The cost was staggering. Of the 480 that had entered the spire, barely 200 stood in the reactor room. The floor was slick with a sickening mixture of yellow fungal acid and bright green Varak blood. The air was so thick with smoke and spores that I couldn't see the ceiling. I slumped against a control console, my left arm entirely useless, hanging limply at my side. Every breath was a ragged, exhausting effort. I watched the surviving Varak. They were unrecognizable from the flawless statues that had stood in the dreadnought staging cavern. Their black armor was scorched brown and gray by plasma fire and acid. Entire limbs were missing, cauterized hastily by their own weapons. Mandibles were shattered. But they weren't thrashing. They weren't shrieking in the dark. They were huddling together. They were sharing battery packs. 2 of them were leaning against each other, physically supporting their weight, emitting a low, comforting chittering sound that I had never heard a Varak make before. It wasn't the cold communication of a hive mind. It was the desperate, empathetic murmur of soldiers trying to keep each other awake. Nash lumbered over to me. He was missing his lower left arm, the stump weeping green fluid. He was carrying a heavy satchel of mining charges. "The core is exposed," he rasped. His mechanical translator was damaged, his voice dropping in and out of static. "Charges are primed. 30 seconds. I nodded, the movement sending a fresh wave of nausea through my stomach. "Good. Set them on the thermal regulators. When those blow, the reactor goes critical. It'll incinerate the entire spire and the root network." Nash placed the charges with agonizing slowness, his remaining hand trembling with exhaustion. He punched the arming code. The red lights began to blink. "Fall back!" I yelled, pushing myself off the console. "Everyone out! We have to clear the blast radius!" The retreat was a grueling, agonizing slog. We dragged our wounded up the stairwells, fighting through the stragglers of the fungal horde. We didn't run. We couldn't. We just ground our way forward, driven by the pure, stubborn refusal to die in the dark. We burst through the ruined blast doors of the lobby just as the timer hit 0. I didn't hear the explosion. I felt it. The ground beneath us bucked violently, throwing me face first into the spongy biomass. A deep, seismic groan echoed from the bowels of the earth. Then, the center of the terraforming spire simply ceased to exist. A blinding pillar of white-hot plasma punched through the roof of the structure, shooting hundreds of feet into the spore-choked sky. The shockwave hit a second later, a wall of superheated air that flattened the fungal growths for a mile in every direction. I lay in the muck, covering my head with my good arm, as debris rained down around us in a fiery hail. When the roar finally subsided, replaced by the crackle of burning biomatter, I rolled onto my back. The sky was changing. The thick canopy of gray spores was burning away, revealing the harsh, bruised purple atmosphere of the dead world. The oppressive, rhythmic thrumming of the fungal network had stopped. We had done it. I looked over at Nash. He was lying on his back, staring up at the clearing sky. His mandibles were slightly parted. "Extraction dropships are inbound," a crisp, mechanical voice chimed in my earpiece. It was the dreadnought in orbit. "Vanguard unit, hold position." I closed my eyes, letting my head fall back into the mud. I was so tired. 2 hours later, I was standing in the medical bay of the Varak dreadnought. My shoulder was locked in a rigid structural brace, the bone knit together by aggressive medical nanites. I still smelled like rot and ozone, despite the sterile air of the ship. I stood by the reinforced glass window, looking down into the staging cavern. The Queen was there. She stood in the center of the room, looking at the survivors of the Vanguard. There were 212 of them. They were not lined up in perfect symmetry. They were sitting on the deck, exhausted, their armor ruined. Some were tending to each other's wounds. Some were simply staring blankly at the walls, processing the trauma of their first solitary brush with mortality. The Queen did not project her voice. She did not attempt to re-establish the connection. She just watched them. The heavy hydraulic whine of the blast doors signaled her approach. She entered the medical bay, ducking her massive head to clear the frame. The smell of wet copper filled the room. She stood beside me, looking down through the glass at her soldiers. "The anomaly is destroyed," she rumbled, her voice a low, gravelly scrape. "The root network has collapsed. The colony is sterile. You accomplished what millions of my network soldiers could not." "We got lucky," I muttered, leaning my good shoulder against the bulkhead. "And we paid in blood." "You did not get lucky, Dean Carter," she said softly. "You taught them how to embrace the zero probability. You taught them how to fight without hope." She looked at me, her compound eyes shifting, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the medbay. "But you have broken them," she continued. There was no anger in her voice, only a deep, profound curiosity. "I cannot reconnect them to the hive. The trauma they have experienced, the fear, the pain, the isolation. If I reintegrate them, that trauma will broadcast to the entire species. It would cause a systemic psychological collapse. They are forever severed." I looked back down at the cavern. I saw Nash sitting against a bulkhead, his missing arm wrapped in the thermal bandages. Beside him, the soldier with the crushed leg was resting its heavy head against Nash's shoulder. "They aren't broken," I said quietly. "They're just awake." "They are inefficient," the Queen countered. "They are emotional. They mourn their dead. They hesitate. They are flawed." "Yeah," I said, a bitter, exhausted smile touching the corners of my mouth. "They're a mess. But I'll tell you something, Your Majesty. The next time you find yourselves backed into a corner and the math tells you to lay down and die, those 200 flawed, broken soldiers down there, they're the only ones who are going to step forward." The Queen was silent for a long time. She watched Nash hand a water ration to his crippled squad mate. "My father was right," she finally whispered, the grinding of her voice softening into something resembling awe. "Your kind is not merely stubborn. You are contagious. You infect the universe with your desperation. I turned away from the window, walking toward the exit. I had a busted plasma manifold waiting for me back on the station, and I was severely behind schedule. Just make sure their check's clear, I said over my shoulder. And tell them they did good. If you enjoyed this descent into the gritty, unyielding spirit of humanity, hit that like button to help us outsmart the algorithm.